So thanks first off to everyone for being here, and thank you to Francis for inviting me along. So as Francis said, I would have a little bit experience in this regard on account of the fact that I am a home economics teacher in Ireland, and I was diagnosed with non-celiac gluten intolerance back in, sorry, I'll skip to here for a second, back in 2013. And since then, actually very recently, my GP has referred me on for further testing because they feel that I actually have a wheat allergy. So I have a little bit of experience in a lot of these topics. So I won't dwell on that for now, but I would have experience both from the classroom, the food classroom, and also I live with gluten intolerance, wheat allergy, but whatever it turns out to be shortly when I go to see the specialist. So I teach all year groups, first year to sixth year. I also work with our students with autism in our autism classroom in Michaela, and I have an Instagram account called the Gluten Free Mummy, and through that I share my own gluten-free recipes and product recommendations and things like that. I've mentioned to you about my own history personally, and just of late, as I said, I actually had an anaphylactic reaction recently when I was eating out in a restaurant, which had never happened before. So typically my symptoms with what I thought was a non-celiac gluten intolerance would have been vomiting and kind of vertigo-like symptoms. But the last time I had a reaction, I actually had an anaphylactic reaction. So I've now been prescribed an EpiPen for that. So the intolerance, celiac disease, wheat allergy, they're all along the same lines, but there is quite significant differences between them. So that's the first thing I'm going to look at, because I think as teachers, we do need to know the difference between the three. And I think the term gluten intolerant gets thrown around quite a lot. Some people choose to be gluten-free by choice, which is absolutely fine. But for others, it is quite serious. So I feel there might be a tendency out there to kind of take gluten intolerance or gluten-free with a pinch of salt on account of Gwyneth Paltrow and the likes of those. But for people who do suffer from non-celiac gluten intolerance, as well as obviously celiac disease and wheat allergy, the symptoms can be very serious and very difficult to live with. So it's something as teachers we need to be aware of. So celiac disease, first of all, it is a serious illness. And it is not a food allergy as such, but rather it's an autoimmune disease. So when you consume gluten, it actually affects the lining of the gut, so the lining of your small intestine, which as food teachers would be familiar with. So the villi in the small intestine are fattened, and that will actually affect the body's ability to absorb nutrients from food. So for someone with celiac disease, whether or not they're symptomatic, because some people actually aren't, it is very, very important for them to follow a strict gluten-free diet. Because if not, as I said, the lining of the gut can be damaged, and that can affect their ability to absorb nutrients from food. So first off, celiac disease is a disease. It's an autoimmune disease. After that, then, just have a quick look at what a wheat allergy is. Now, this is actually quite new to me, even as I said, I would always have been familiar with celiac disease and gluten intolerance, but wheat allergy is something that I've had to look into more recently on account of personal experience. So if you have a wheat allergy, exposure to wheat proteins can prime your immune system for an allergic reaction. So it's not specifically gluten. If you have a wheat allergy, your body can have an allergic reaction or an allergic type reaction to any of the proteins that are found in wheat. So albumin, globulin, gliadin, and gluten. An allergic reaction is triggered, and it usually occurs within seconds or minutes of eating. Now, over the years, in recent years, particularly in my own case, that's certainly the way my reactions would have been. I will be sick within minutes of eating anything, even with trace amounts of wheat or gluten or whatever the case may be. But I was not aware of the fact that that means that I'm more likely to have a wheat allergy than a gluten intolerance. So wheat allergy, it is sometimes confused with celiac disease, but the conditions are very different. A wheat allergy occurs when your body produces antibodies to proteins found in wheat, but in celiac disease, it's specific to the protein gluten that's found in wheat. So a different immune reaction, or an immune system reaction, is triggered when you are a celiac who consumes gluten. And as I said previously, very, very important for celiacs to avoid gluten on account of the fact that it will affect absorption if they are consuming gluten in their diet. Non-celiac gluten intolerance, then, it's less serious than celiac disease in the sense that it's not an autoimmune disease. And there's not a whole lot that's known about gluten intolerance in terms of the causes or even how it affects the body. It does seem to affect people in a less serious manner, but the symptoms can still be very unpleasant and they can affect quality of life. So for people with non-celiac gluten intolerance, the symptoms that are experienced are often similar to those experienced by celiac disease, but it's not quite clear how the immune system is involved or if it's involved at all. And there also doesn't appear to be damage to the gut lining. So there is a very clear distinction in the sense that a gluten intolerance does not affect absorption. It is not at the same level of severity, I suppose, as celiac disease would be in terms of overall general health. So I've added a few slides here on prevalence and on the importance of reading labels, but I'm going to go quickly through them and leave, as Frances said, you will have access to the PowerPoint, and I don't think these are the most pertinent for teachers. So if it's something you're interested in, you can go back and have a look by all means, but I'm going to move on here to hidden gluten because I think as teachers, this is what we need to be aware of. So naturally gluten-free foods, there are basically any natural food that has not been processed, bar cereals, so wheat, oats, barley, and rye, it's going to be gluten-free. So the likes of fresh meat, poultry, fish, seafood, dairy products, and anything that has been unprocessed, so fruit, vegetables, they're all naturally gluten-free. But the problem, as we know, is that many of the foods that we are surrounded by in supermarkets today have been processed in some way, shape, or form. So if, for example, the key, sorry, I'll just read from here. The key is that they're whole foods and they're not processed in some way that could involve a gluten-containing ingredient. So a fresh chicken is 100% safe for celiac, for gluten intolerant students, for a student with a wheat allergy, but breaded chicken nuggets are almost certainly not, unless they've been breaded gluten-free coating and are labeled as such. Breads, legumes, nuts, herbs, spices are also fine in their most natural stage, but you will need to check the labeling if they've been processed, such as canned lentil soup, or even something that caught me out for years was spices, because often spices, although technically they're gluten-free, they may be produced on the same line as maybe herbs or spices or other ingredients that do contain gluten, and that cross-contamination is enough to cause problems for somebody who has an intolerance or an allergy to gluten or wheat. So first off, it is important that you know how to check ingredients. Now, as a teacher, I suppose this falls more to the student themselves as opposed to you, unless your school is supplying ingredients, in which case you will have more of a role to play here. But one thing that's important is that we're familiar with the fact that wheat can be under different names on food labels, and your students with wheat allergy or gluten allergy or intolerances or whatever it may be, they are the ones who really need to be familiar with the different names that wheat can take on food labeling. So gluten from wheat, barley, or rye is also present in things like yeast and soy sauce. Oats we hear a lot about, and people are often very confused around oats. Oats are naturally gluten-free. So the gluten-containing grains are wheat, oats, barley, and rye is what we would say in a classroom, or certainly what we would say as make teachers here in Ireland. But oats in their natural state are gluten-free. The issue is that oats are typically processed on the same line or within the same factory as gluten-containing cereals. So due to cross-contamination, it's unsafe for celiacs or, as I said, anyone else with gluten allergies or so on, to consume oats that have not been produced separately in a manner that ensures they are actually safe and gluten-free for those of us with allergies and intolerances to eat. So hidden gluten in terms of your classroom, if you're cooking with students in your classroom, again, there's lots up here, but I think that just shows really how careful people with allergies have to be. So things like soy sauce, teriyaki sauce, cereals, soups, as we know, roux-based particularly, but packet soups as well. So dried soups would often have the flour added. Salad dressings, marinades, barbecue sauces, as I said earlier, fermented vinegars, taco seasonings. And I'll stop talking for a moment and let you look through these here. So your stock cubes will be one we use quite regularly in our classroom. Sausages, deli meats, again, cross-contamination, anything from a deli, if it's been sliced with the same machine that your breaded ham or your breaded meats have been sliced with, it's no longer gluten-free and not safe for somebody who has an allergy. Chips, another one, we think chips, potatoes, gluten-free, but if they're fried in the same oil as anything containing gluten, they're no longer gluten-free, and they can cause a reaction for people with any of your celiac disease, gluten intolerance, gluten allergy, or so on. Nuts, crisps, and malted milkshakes, because the malt and barley would be gluten containing. Some chocolates, ice creams. So yeah, so the list is very extensive, and it is very important that even if you are someone who has lived with a gluten intolerance or a wheat allergy, celiac disease for years, manufacturers change their ingredients regularly, or are prone to, can do. So even if you've been eating something for years and you feel it's safe, it's very, very important that you always check the labels, or that you make sure that it scans in your Celiac UK app, or we have the same, an Irish version here in Ireland, Celiac Society of Ireland app or booklet, which will have the most up-to-date information on products that are actually safe to eat. So for you guys as teachers then, I suppose it comes down to a risk assessment in terms of determining whether or not it's going to be safe for students, maybe even to take home economics, as I would call it, or food, your food classes. I will run through very quickly the symptoms. I'm conscious of my time here now, of the three different things I've mentioned so far. So celiac disease, the symptoms vary, and it can be very difficult to diagnose. Some people go many, many, many years before it's diagnosed because the symptoms are so varied and they range from mild to severe. It can be very frustrating because it's very hard to pinpoint, and it's known as a multi-system disorder in the sense that oftentimes when you think of celiac disease, you think it's going to affect the abdominal area, which it often does. But for others, they have no symptoms abdominally, and they actually have symptoms such as headaches, confusion, anxiety, and other symptoms that would more affect your head, like vertigo-like symptoms and dizziness and so on. So again, all of the symptoms are listed there, and I'll let you go through them in more detail in your own time. As you can see, very expansive and very difficult to pinpoint that it may be celiac that is the cause. So again, it is currently we say that, or the Celiac Society of Ireland says that there is 1 in 100 people diagnosed with celiac disease. It's the same in the UK as in Ireland. But if you have a close relative, a close blood relative who has been diagnosed with celiac disease, your chances of having it actually jump up to 1 in 10. Very important that if you or if any of your students or anyone you know feels that they could have celiac disease, do not remove gluten from your diet. Not until you've had a scope done to test for celiac disease, because your villi will naturally repair themselves once you follow a gluten-free diet strictly. So you may have celiac disease, but once you start following a gluten-free diet, if you go for a scope thereafter, your results could come back normal. So it's important that you don't remove gluten from your diet until you've been tested for celiac disease. So a wheat allergy, then, it's more of an immediate response if you consume foods containing wheat. So avoiding wheat is the primary treatment for wheat allergy. Avoiding gluten is the primary treatment for a gluten allergy or celiac disease. A child with a wheat allergy is likely to develop symptoms very, very quickly. So swelling, itching, irritation, mouth or throat. So that's sort of anaphylactic reaction, hives, nasal congestion, headache, and so on. And in serious cases, anaphylaxis. And in terms of gluten intolerance, as I mentioned earlier, similar symptoms to that of celiac disease, but they oftentimes are less severe. But that's not to say that we should take gluten intolerance with a pinch of salt either, because students who suffer with this, and I'm sure yourselves, if anybody out there is suffering from this as well, it still has a very big negative impact on your life. And it's almost worse because you can't say, oh, I have celiac disease, that's why I'm experiencing these symptoms. You're saying gluten intolerance, which for those of us who've gone years saying that, oftentimes in a restaurant you'll almost see eyes rolling when you say that. So it's not taken very seriously, but it does impact on people's lives very seriously. So symptoms with gluten intolerance tend to develop within hours or days, and the same with celiac disease, as opposed to wheat allergy, whereby the symptoms tend to occur very quickly. So practicalities within our home economics kitchen. The key thing to remember is that even tiny amounts of gluten can cause people with celiac disease to have symptoms in the short term, and most significantly gut damage in the long term. So in the case of a student with a wheat allergy, the onset of symptoms will likely be more immediate. Myself here in the classroom, I don't mean to keep going back talking about myself, that's not my intention. It's just if you have students with a wheat allergy or gluten intolerance, I'm going to stick with wheat allergy for the minute because I feel that's what it is that I've been experiencing. I would always wear a mask in the classroom when we're baking over the past few years, because I found myself vomiting, sorry, to use a disgusting word, but I would vomit after every practical class. And I didn't know what was causing it. I wasn't eating gluten, but when I went to my dietitian, what she said was that I was inhaling it. And by inhaling it, I was swallowing it. So because it seems that I may actually have a wheat allergy, that is probably why my reactions or my symptoms were so quick and happened so quickly. You may have students in your class like that. You may have other students that won't show any signs or symptoms of issues in the class itself, but maybe off sick the next day on account of problems due to having inhaled or eaten gluten or wheat, whatever the case may be. So to prevent cross-contamination, which is the huge thing within the home and within the classroom, you can follow the following steps. Now, I'm very aware that the nature of our subject, there is wheat flour around, and unless it's feasible for you to put in place an entire gluten-free classroom, you will never be able to 100% say your classroom is a safe environment for people with celiac disease, gluten intolerance, or wheat allergy. But you can certainly we can all make our best efforts. So by wiping down surfaces with hot soapy water, the soap is, as in washing up liquid, is sufficient to remove any wheat or gluten that may be on the surfaces. Clean pots and pans with hot water and washing up liquid just to ensure that all traces of gluten and wheat are removed. Consider keeping separate cloths and tea towels for the gluten-free students. I cannot stress enough that even the tiniest little bit of gluten or wheat, or even the tiniest crumb of bread or a biscuit, if that's ingested by a student with celiac disease, it can cause problems for them in terms of it can cause issues with their villi. So every tiny amount of gluten, if you've a child with celiac disease specifically, it really we need to avoid them coming in contact with it where possible. Separate bread boards, separate chopping boards for gluten-free and gluten-containing ingredients or foods. That is something that I think all of us can probably do, even if we were in schools like my own where funding isn't super. I'm sure we can all go that far where we can all have breadboards and chopping boards that are separate for gluten-free and gluten-containing foods. And I would go so far as to label them and make sure that every student in every class is aware that these boards are specifically and only for gluten-free foods, because it only takes a crumb, as I said, to cause problems for students with allergies. If they're using toasters, my personal advice would be use a separate toaster. You can use toaster bags for the gluten-free bread, which can help prevent cross-contamination. But for me, the safest way to do it is to use a separate toaster. Again, I put a label on the front of it that says gluten-free toaster only. I have one here myself beside me that I use for my own toast at lunch. Use a separate fryer, air fryer for gluten-free foods. Again, I am so conscious of the fact that not every school has a lot of funding. I'm from one of those schools myself, and we do our best. But if at all possible, where you can, if you could invest in a separate fryer or air fryer, whichever it is that you use mostly within your school for students who are gluten-free, that would be fantastic. Different butter knives or dishes and jam spoons to prevent breadcrumbs from getting into condiments. I mean, our students clean up their own equipment, and some are better than others, as we know. So if you want to be incredibly safe, the safest you can be, I would be using different butter knives, or have a small little stash. It doesn't need to be many, a small stash of butter knives, dishes, and so on that is used only by the gluten-free students, and that will help prevent cross-contamination. The same with condiments. If there's butter, jam in the fridge, they don't want to be, as I said to my husband, he can't double dip, as in he can't put the spoon back into the jam a second time if he's using regular bread, because all it takes is one crumb to cause illness. Students with celiac disease, I mentioned in my own case, I always wear a dust mask in class, because if they inhale flour, for someone with celiac disease, gluten intolerance, wheat allergy, it is enough to actually, by breathing it in, they swallow it, and it is enough to cause problems. For me, in my case, it would cause vomiting within minutes if I am not wearing my mask. There have been days here, and after a class that might have been baking, I come in without my mask. I don't do it anymore. I've learned the hard way. And even by being in the room after students have been baking, it's enough to make me have to leave and go and get sick. So it's very important that students take the initiative themselves, that they're advised by their teacher. If you have an allergy to wheat, or if you have celiac disease or gluten intolerance, it is best for you to wear a dust mask in class to minimize the amount of flour that you're inhaling. And flour can remain airborne for up to 24 hours. So it can actually affect students later in the day, even if they're not the ones baking in the classroom. Again, I apologize for going so quickly. I'm just conscious of time. So in an ideal world, again, that's not the case in Dunmore, County Galway, unfortunately, but home economics departments might consider only using gluten-free flour blends within the classroom if there is a student in that classroom with celiac disease, etc. However, I'm very conscious and I'm very aware that this will depend on a number of different factors, including your school's funding agreement from school management, parents, students, etc. It very much is a school to school basis, and it will not work for everybody. It doesn't work for me. Currently, we're in the process of seeing, can we figure out doing something like that so that I can actually continue to teach in the classroom. But even for us, and this has been a long time going on, we haven't got there yet. If that cannot be done, at very minimum, ensure that your classroom is well ventilated. So when wheat flour has been used, your celiac students, gluten-free students are wearing their masks, and you have windows open, doors open, extractor fans on, whatever is suitable or is workable within your classroom. So another thing here that comes up a lot is chips, as I mentioned earlier. So chips by their nature should be gluten-free if they haven't been coated with flour. But even if they are technically gluten-free, they're no longer safe to eat if they've been cooked in the same oil as gluten-containing foods. And a lot of people within the gluten-free community will know that. But a lot of people don't realize that it's really the same when it comes to baking in the same oven as gluten-containing foods. So if baking gluten-free products, it's important that they are either kept completely separate. Again, we don't have this here. I'm talking ideal world scenario. If you could have an oven that was specifically designated for gluten-free products, fantastic. If not, best case scenario, avoid any non-gluten-free products being in the oven at the same time as your gluten-free products, because obviously we know our ovens work by convection, circulation of air. So the flour particles will inevitably end up on the gluten-free foods. Another thing, so I mentioned that a dedicated gluten-free oven if possible, and not to use an oven that has previously or recently been used to bake gluten-containing ingredients. And gluten-free food should not be cooked in the same oven as gluten-containing ingredients at the same time. So I'll move on to kind of tips then from there. Apologies. So the role of gluten in baking, first of all, I know I'm talking to very well-educated home economics teachers, probably know this a lot better than me, but gluten, we use it in baking for to give elasticity, to allow our baked goods to rise. So without it, then you're going to be left with baked goods that can be quite dry and crumbly. They don't have good rise, maybe. They can be quite dense and quite heavy. And for that reason, lots of people think, ew, gluten-free, gross. But that doesn't have to be the case. So when you're working without gluten, it just means you'll have to adjust your recipes for the final products to be as close as possible to traditional original ones, or you'll have to use a recipe that has been specifically designed for gluten-free flour blends. So I keep saying gluten-free flour blends. That's because unlike with wheat flour, so self-raising wheat flour, plain wheat flour, that's just wheat flour. But in order to mimic the properties of wheat flour, gluten-free flours, we combine a number of different ones into what we call a gluten-free flour blend, so that you have the best results from your baking. So there's no individual gluten-free flour that can be used as an all-purpose gluten-free flour. Instead of a single one, to make most gluten-free recipes, you'll need a blend of a few different flours. And my best advice would be, don't whip out a recipe that's designed for a gluten-containing flour and try to use it with gluten-free flours and expect the same success, because that's unlikely to happen. If you are using gluten-free flour or gluten-free flour blends in the classroom, I would advise that you use a recipe that's specifically designed and tried and tested for gluten-free flours or flour blends, and I'll go through that with you shortly. You can make your own gluten-free flour blends, but you'll spend maybe €50 in the health shop to try and get everything you need. So my advice would be to buy a pre-made one. That just helps to simplify the process. So the free gluten-free self-raising white flour is the one I always use. I think it's actually, they're made in the UK. And oftentimes these gluten-free flour blends will also include a gum or a starch that helps to kind of mimic gluten and bind the ingredients together. The one that you will come across the most is called xanthan gum. Now, xanthan gum, there's nothing I make at home that doesn't have xanthan gum in it, because without it, you're going to have that dry, crumbly texture. So it's a type of starch. It's used to improve texture and shelf life. And as I said, oftentimes it's already in the flour blend already. So if you read the ingredients list, you'll often see xanthan gum there, or a different, I think it's pronounced guar gum, I'm not quite sure, but the one that I would use a lot at home, again, it's produced by Free, is the xanthan gum, I should say. And there's a very good video there on BBC Good Food. I've included the link if you'd like to learn more about it. You can click on that in your own time and have a look. So as I mentioned, this is another form of thickener that can be used in gluten-free foods. I'm not as familiar with it, but I just popped it up there for your information, and I'll just move on quickly from there to ensure we get through the rest. The other thing with gluten-free baking is that it's very important to bake at the correct temperature, because gluten-free flour doesn't contain the proteins that help trap heat and moisture. So baked goods, when you're baking with gluten-free flour, can dry out very quickly if they're overcooked. As a general rule, bake the gluten-free goods at a lower temperature than you would conventional wheat-based recipes, and this will help prevent them from drying out or becoming overcooked. But all of us are busy enough, I think, at the minute as food teachers. The last thing we need is to be trying to work out different temperatures that we bake different products at. As I said, use a gluten-free recipe for your gluten-free students, and then you won't have to worry about temperatures or xanthan gums or any of that, because it's all going to be on there. Measure accurately. So I know this is across the board. These are important points to remember when baking in general, but because gluten-free flour blends often have different ratios of flour to starch, it can impact the texture quite a lot if you don't measure your ingredients properly. So use the digital scales for best results rather than measuring in cups, which I think most of us would do. Certainly here in Ireland, I expect in the UK as well. So your UK recipes usually are measured out or in grams. So that would be best practice, I guess, rather than measuring in cups. Avoid overmixing, and it's simply because you will knock out all that lovely air you've sieved in and you've gently mixed in, and that will result again in rubbery, tough baked goods. So when you're working with a gluten-free batter or gluten-free dough, everything is gentle. Like when you're making a sponge cake, how everything is just very gently mixed in. Everything you do that's gluten-free, nice and gentle, and don't overmix, just mix until things are combined, because that air is critical in gluten-free baking as a raising agent, on account of the fact that we don't have the same stretch as gluten would provide. So we need as much air as possible to give as good a rise as possible in the doughs. Bake until done. Again, so if you're using a traditional recipe, you'll have to adapt it slightly, because gluten-free products often take a little bit longer. So again, to prevent that, use a gluten-free specific recipe. Gluten-free flour blends tend to absorb more liquid than wheat flours, and this means they may require more liquid, and that in turn can affect the baking times. So they often take longer in the oven than traditional wheat-based baked products. Be sure to bake them until they're golden brown, spring back, as we all know. But again, as I said, to prevent any of that issue or those issues, I would use a specific recipe. So to ensure success when gluten-free baking, I've said this about 50 times now, I apologize, it is best to use recipes that have been specifically designed, tried and tested for gluten-free baking. And one of your own there in the UK is the best recommendation I can give, and that's Becky Excel. Her recipes are all gluten-free. She has celiac disease. She's absolutely, her recipes are incredible. I have found through the years, I will look up a gluten-free recipe and it might require 6 different flours and different starches and all these different ingredients. And as I said, you go into Holland and Barrett then and you could spend €50 and it still doesn't turn out right. So my go-tos are the easy ones, the fail-safe recipes, and the ones that I find the best are the gluten-free cup of tea, which is Becky Excel, and also Free, which is the product of, or the brand of flour that I told you earlier that I used. They have some really nice, simple, easy to do in classroom recipes up on their website as well. And then I popped in my own website there as well. Again, they're recipes that I would have tried, tested at home. I'm no expert. This is all as a home ec teacher, that's the amount of expertise I have, and the fact that I've been gluten-free for as long as I have. I've tried and tested different things. And again, you'll see the recipes on my website are all very simple. I don't do complicated things, not in the classroom, not outside of it. So everything is nice and simple. Your typical things like your scones, your muffins, your cupcakes, all of the things you would like to make in a classroom with students. And that's it. So that's me kind of wrapped up there. I will, in a couple of minutes, answer any questions you may have. I really do apologize for how quickly I've spoken. I'm just conscious of time. And my source of information are popped up there as well. If you'd like to see them in your own time, you're welcome to have a closer look. So thank you, everyone, for listening and putting up with me throughout the last however long I've been on there.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Niamh. That was
Thank
a roller coaster through some information. So
Very
thank you.
fast.
But as you've said, we will be sharing the PowerPoint presentation. So there's lots more information in there that Niamh wasn't able to cover just in that sort of 20 minutes, half an hour. But I think it really got across how important it is for teachers to be aware and be careful about what they're doing. And actually I think you've provided some really good hints and tips there. Thank you. And one of the things actually you were talking about using a face mask. So just a bit personal thing for me, I've got an anaphylactic reaction to eggs. And I used to, when I was teaching, when we used to make quiche in year 8, I would always get a really bad reaction, particularly to my face, and I would never know why, because I hadn't touched the eggs or hadn't eaten them, but it was because it was in the air.
Yes.
So I do know exactly what you mean for that. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm now going to share my PowerPoint, and I've just got a few resources that I'd like to share with everybody, and then we'll come back to you, Niamh, for some questions at the end. Lovely, thank you.
Should I stop sharing now, Frances?
I'm going to stop sharing on your behalf, actually.
Perfect, thank you very much.
Okay, so hopefully everybody should be able to see my presentation now. Okay, so just a few resources that I wanted to share. So as you probably know, we've got lots and lots of resources on the Food Facts of Life website, and we've got a number around the adverse reaction to food. So that could be allergies and intolerances, or it could also be food poisoning and that sort of thing as well. So we've got lots in 11 to 14 years and also 14 to 16 years, and including food labelling. And we've got our knowledge organisers. If you haven't seen those yet, we've got very comprehensive knowledge organisers for all topics that's on the Food Facts of Life website, and the things that you need to be covering in school. And there's one particularly about, that's a 14 to 16 one on the screen there, and that's about food labelling and health claims, and that's got something about allergies and intolerances on. And then also we've got some resources that the pupils can use. We've got lots of worksheets around adapting recipes and identifying ingredients on labels that are allergenic ingredients. And then we've also got this one here, which is a chef's recipe card. And I think this is quite a nice one, actually, because it's quite a good way to get pupils to have a look at recipes and for them to actually identify what the allergenic ingredients might be, and then actually create a recipe card for it, so that if they were imagining that they were in a restaurant and they were creating something like this for their customers in the restaurant, and it just gets them beginning to think a little bit about the ingredients that they're going to be using. Something else about classroom management. So Niamh's talked a lot about it from her personal experience, and obviously Niamh's in Ireland, but everything that she's been talking about is very relevant to wherever you're teaching, and we do have some international colleagues with us today as well. We've got lots of resources for teachers to support your classroom management around good food hygiene and safety practices, and particularly around risk assessments. So we've got some exemplars on the website. Please, though, if you are going to be having a look at our exemplar resources, do make sure that you do what we call adopt and adapt. So don't just download the risk assessments and think, oh, I've got that now, I can put that in my folder. You need to make sure that it is actually adapted to your particular setting. We've got our documents, which are called the characteristics of good practice, and we have those for teachers who teach primary, secondary, and pupils with additional needs. And throughout that, each of those documents, there is advice and support around food allergies, intolerances, but also food hygiene and safety, and other classroom management aspects. There is some free training from the Food Standards Agency that you might be interested in having a look. And I know some schools have actually got their pupils to do their training, the older pupils, which I think is quite useful for them to do. We have a webinar recording from a couple of years ago, but it's another colleague of ours, Alex, and myself, talking about adverse reactions to food and the management of allergens in the classroom, and that's more general. So today we've been focusing on gluten and wheat, but that's a bit more general. And then talking about the FSA, there's food allergy and intolerance information. And then I also thought I would put the Food Standards Authority Ireland on there as well. So if there's any of Niamh's colleagues from Ireland, that they can have a look at that website. And the picture that's on the screen there is actually something that we came across when we went to a school a few years ago. And the food technician in the school had taken a Food Standards Agency allergen chart, and I've put the link on the screen, and they've actually had it blown up and put onto a whiteboard. And what they do at the beginning of the week is that the teacher identifies, for all of recipes that have been directed for the pupils to make that week, they identify within those recipes what the allergenic ingredients are. So they put that up in the classroom so everybody knows what the allergenic ingredients are that are being used that week. And I thought that was a really nice idea, something that's actually really simple and a really good way of both teachers and pupils being very aware of what they're using in the classroom. A little bit of a plug for our roadmaps here. You may well have come across these already. These are something that we're really pleased with and we have recently published. But these are basically a curriculum journey for food nutrition education from 3 to 16. But within these, there will be aspects of food allergy and intolerance and being aware of ingredients and ingredient management from the pupil's point of view, that you'd be able to identify by having a look at these roadmaps and thinking, okay, that's something I need to make sure that I cover at this particular stage of their learning journey and when it needs to be reinforced and gone over again. So I just thought I'd show you those just in case you hadn't seen them, because they're quite useful for planning and auditing schemes of work and lessons. Just a little bit about keeping up to date with our free resources and our training. So if you're not registered for our education news email, please do so. We also have a PPD newsletter, that's our training newsletter. That doesn't come out very often, but when it does, it's specifically about training. We're also on Twitter, or X as it is now. We have an email address, an education@nutrition.org.uk email address. And then also you might be interested in registering for our BNF news. So that's a bit more general news about nutrition and healthy eating. So, and that comes out once a month as well. Before we come to questions for Niamh, a little bit more about training. So quite short notice, I know, but we do have a hands-on interactive conference at Caffrey in Northern Ireland on Saturday, and we do have a few spaces left for that. So if you fancy joining us, that would be fantastic. That's free. And then we do have another one in January 24, which is at Harper Adams University. So the bookings for both of those are open. And then also we've got free modular online courses. So there's lots around functional properties of food, sensory science, food spoilage, etc. And then the characteristics documents I mentioned earlier on, we have free online courses for each of those too. And then as today's webinar is being recorded, all of our other training is recorded, and we do have those recordings available on YouTube if you wanted to have a look back at any of those. So before we finish, I don't know, Ewan, have you been keeping an eye on the chat box? I've got a couple of questions myself for Niamh, but has anybody else had any questions?
We've just got a couple coming in now. Right, so the first one is, does glue used for art class have wheat in it?
Yeah, I guess that would probably depend on the glue that's been used. I know that Play-Doh, a lot of Play-Dohs would have wheat in them, so possibly glues would as well, but I would expect you to have to ask the art teacher and check the ingredients on the glue, I suppose, to be sure.
Great, thanks, Niamh. And then Charlotte Watkins asks, do you have short crust pastry and bread recipes, please?
I do have bread recipes up there, gluten-free bread recipes. Short crust, I have, I think, an apple tart recipe on my website, but if not, Becky Excel is queen. Like, Becky Excel is my go-to. She's fantastic. She's UK based. And if there's anything I don't have there, go to her. If I am getting them myself, I go to her.
Brilliant. Thanks, Niamh. So I think that was it for questions, but just to say we had some really nice comments. You may have read them in the chat as well. So people really enjoyed the session. Kim said it would also be very useful for science lessons as well, so that was something interesting to think about. And you've made some people purchase some different colour tea towels as well. So,
Oh, that's good.
so yeah, the information
You can
information's
send some
getting
over
through.
to me because we don't have the funding to buy some here.
Great. And actually on that point, Ewan, actually we around different equipment for pupils who've got allergies, quite often you come across purple equipment, and I was having a look at one of the main equipment manufacturers today, or suppliers, and they definitely have a big range of purple equipment. So if you do have funding in school and you are able to buy some separate equipment that you can keep in a box and keep it separate for the pupils, purple's quite a good idea, because then that makes it very obvious that that's just for those pupils. Okay, a couple of questions for me then. So what would your top tip be for managing successful gluten-free cooking in school?
I think I've burnt the ears off of people with this tip already, but I would be using gluten-free flour blends. I wouldn't go making your own, because even with the amount of experience I have, I still work out better with the flour blends. So things like the brand free. Also always use xanthan gum. During my research, I came across the guar gum. I can't even pronounce it, probably pronounce it wrong, but the one that is in most supermarkets and that is readily available is xanthan gum. Half a teaspoon to most recipes of xanthan gum will effectively have quite a good effect, and in terms of mimicking gluten. So without xanthan gum, you won't have the same level of success with gluten-free baking. And the third thing that I said a lot was to use a gluten-free recipe. That's not to say they're very different as such. It's just that the temperatures will have been tried and tested, the exact amounts of liquid have been tried and tested. So it saves you the hassle of having to figure all that out yourself using a traditional wheat-based recipe.
Great, thank you. And then there was actually something you were talking about. Obviously, it's very important for the teachers to be aware of all of this and to manage the classroom. But equally for the pupils and the parents, it's important that they're aware of everything that they can do. So I was just wondering if there's anything that you can suggest that teachers say to their parents or the pupils that they can do for themselves to help themselves.
I feel like if there's a student coming into school with a food allergy, intending to take food classes, the teacher needs to be aware of that in advance. And I think particularly in Ireland, we're very good with this around nut allergies. That tends to come, the paperwork tends to come in enrollment night, and we're very aware of nut allergies. But other food intolerances and allergies, we're not really made aware of until they're in the classroom, unless it's an anaphylactic reaction like nut or egg sometimes. So I think maybe from a management point of view, maybe parents and students should be, anyone that's signing up to home ec or food studies should be maybe asked to provide that information prior to them coming in, because then that helps with the teachers doing their risk assessment as well. For a child with a gluten intolerance, they may have no issues with working around flour, whereas for a child with a wheat allergy, they might get very sick instantly. So maybe home ec or food studies isn't the right choice for them in a school like mine, to be fair, where we cannot guarantee that, for now at least, that wheat will not be used in the classroom. So these are things that maybe need to be talked about with the teacher prior to the student selecting the subject.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. And then the final one is, what's your most successful gluten-free recipe to make in school? I know that might be different. I'm going to ask you two, actually. School and home. School and home.
Yeah, I make much the same at school and at home. I'm very much the traditional home economics teacher who has my few good recipes that I use. I know my 5th years, we made my brownies the other day, and they want to make them again. They can't stop talking about them. So brownies work really well. The queen cakes would work really well. Cookies, all your simple things. Nothing complicated. Pavlova, but we know that's nothing special. But all of the basics, like your queen cakes, they love them. Cookies, brownies, they're the key ones, both at home and at school. Will be the main ones I'd make. Yeah.
Great, brilliant. And I have to say, I've had a look at your website, and there are some really nice looking recipes on there. So I can certainly recommend that for teachers to have a look at too. And we were having a conversation the other day about gluten-free crumpets, weren't we? So that's still the challenge for me, is to try and work out how to make gluten-free crumpets.
I have to figure that one out. Yes.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ewan, have there been any other questions?
So we were just asking what the name of the supplier was that was mentioned.
For the gluten-free flours, or for the product?
I'm not sure. Sorry.
No, I think it's probably the equipment. It's Nisbets actually. So that's the supplier of equipment.
Okay.
So Nisbets.
And there was one more. Actually, there's a couple more. One person mentioned that xanthan gum possibly could also cause an allergic reaction in some people. I believe that's rare, but yeah, that's probably something.
Yeah, but it is a
bear in
possibility.
mind.
Yeah, it is. Sorry. Yeah, I'm being very general and focused on the wheat and gluten here. Yes, it can. It is an allergen as well. Rare, but it is an allergen. So that's something that would have to be taken into account by teachers as well.
Great. And one more question. Have you ever found a dinner roll recipe that allows you to shape bread into plats or not?
Never tried it. No, I mean, as I said, I keep things simple. That's how it has worked for me. I've never tried to, it took me years to develop a simple white bread recipe that I'm happy with, gluten-free. So no, I've never gone more complex. Come back to me in 5 years. Maybe I will have tried by then. Apologies. No, everything I do is quite simple. But as I said, Becky Excel would have far more complex recipes out there if you want to try something more adventurous than mine.
Okay. Right. Okay. Well, I think we've probably come to the end now. So thank you so much, Niamh. I really appreciate it. I've learned a lot tonight, and I'm hoping that the teachers that have joined us have as well. I'm sure they have. So thank you very much to you. Thank you very much to everybody that's joined us. Hopefully, once we finish the webinar, you will be directed automatically to the online evaluation. If you're not, please don't worry, we will send that to you tomorrow. And as we said earlier, and Ewan's put in the chat, the video of today's webinar will be available on the website, hopefully by Friday. We have got our conference on Saturday, so we are quite busy getting ourselves sorted out for that. But we'll aim to get it online by Friday. If not, it will be early next week, but we'll let you all know. So thank you, Ewan, for joining us as well. And have a good evening, everybody. Thank you very much.
Frances.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.